They thought they were just destroying another carpenter's workshop in a sleepy mountain town. The members of Iron Legion MC roared into James Cooper's yard that night, their chrome-plated bikes gleaming under the moonlight as they approached his hand-built workspace with its weathered oak sign and meticulously organized tools. What these hardened outlaws didn't realize was that this modest woodworker had spent 12 years in Delta Force. Before we dive into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy stories of justice being served, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got another incredible tale waiting for you tomorrow. Now let's begin. Leading some of the military's most classified operations against international weapons smuggling rings, his quiet demeanor and sawdust-covered apron concealed a tactical mind that had dismantled terrorist networks across 4 continents. Now, watching the bikers circle his workshop from his darkened home office, James recognized the telltale signs of an organized criminal enterprise expanding its territory. He could have let it go, could have filed an insurance claim like everyone else who'd watched Iron Legion MC intimidate local businesses throughout Pine Ridge County. Instead, he chose to investigate deeper, a decision that would transform his ransacked workshop into ground zero of a war against one of the region's most sophisticated weapons trafficking operations. By the time the sawdust settled, Iron Legion MC would learn a brutal lesson about judging a craftsman by his calluses, and the entire community would discover that heroes often work with their hands. The autumn wind whistled through Pine Ridge Valley as James Cooper carefully shaped a piece of cherry wood on his lathe, the morning sun streaming through his workshop's windows. The wall clock read 6:45 a.m., early enough to finish Mrs. Peterson's custom kitchen cabinets before starting on the Miller family's dining room table. His weathered hands guided the chisel with practiced precision, mind already planning the day's projects. 2 furniture deliveries, a consultation at the new bed and breakfast, and final touches on the town hall's restoration work. He'd grown to appreciate the simple rhythm of woodworking after 12 years of anything but simple. The radio hummed quietly with local news as he brushed sawdust from his latest piece. The peaceful moment shattered as the distinctive rumble of modified motorcycles echoed through the valley. Through his workshop window, James watched 5 bikes roll past, their riders wearing black leather cuts emblazoned with the Iron Legion MC patch, a medieval helmet wrapped in chains. Years of training kicked in automatically. James's eyes scanned each rider, noting details most would miss. The leader, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and forearms covered in Nordic runes, carried himself with military bearing. The patch on his cut read, Magnus. 2 of his companions positioned themselves at the street corners, standard tactical positioning for controlling an area. James continued working, maintaining his casual demeanor as the bikers made another pass. He could feel their eyes on him, assessing, measuring. In the reflection of his planer's polished surface, he watched them park across the street, their movements synchronized and purposeful. The bell above his workshop door chimed as Magnus entered, boots heavy on the hardwood floor James had laid himself. "Nice setup you got here," Magnus's gravelly voice carried across the workshop. The biker ran a gloved hand along a freshly finished maple table. "Quality craftsmanship." "Thanks," James replied evenly, carefully setting down his chisel. He'd learned long ago that the best defense was appearing unremarkable. "Something I can help you with?" "Maybe." Magnus moved closer, flanked by 2 others. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "See? We've been admiring how you've improved the neighborhood. All these beautiful handmade pieces, restoration projects, custom work, real artisan stuff." James wiped his hands on his apron, noting how the bikers had spread out across his workshop. "Just trying to keep traditional craftsmanship alive." "Thing is," Magnus continued, picking up a hand-carved chess piece from a nearby workbench, "running a business in Pine Ridge these days comes with certain responsibilities. Community obligations, you might say." James took a slow breath, the scent of fresh sawdust mixing with leather and motorcycle exhaust. "I pay my taxes, support local businesses, volunteer at the community center. That's about all the obligation I need." Magnus's smile tightened. The 2 riders at his sides shifted their stance, subtle movements that spoke volumes to James's trained eye. They were positioning for intimidation, not combat. Amateurs. Taxes, Magnus chuckled, setting down the chess piece with deliberate care. Nah, I'm talking about real community support. Iron Legion MC, we're all about protecting local businesses, ensuring stability, for a reasonable monthly contribution, of course. James met Magnus's gaze steadily. I appreciate the offer, but I'll pass. The morning silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Magnus's fingers drummed against the maple table, leaving small smudges on the fresh finish. That's disappointing, he said finally. Real disappointing. See, we're trying to be civil here, professional. But some folks, they need a more direct demonstration of why our protection matters. James carefully set his chisel in its custom-made holder. Is that a threat? Just business advice, Magnus replied, stepping back. Think it over, we'll be around. He signaled to his crew, and the rumble of motorcycles filled the air once again as they rode away. James took out his phone and snapped several pictures of their retreating figures, catching their license plates in the frame. Something about their operation felt off. Too organized for simple protection rackets, too confident in their territory expansion. Inside the workshop, James pulled out a small notebook from behind a false panel in his tool chest. In neat, precise handwriting, he recorded the encounter, the names, the plates. Old habits died hard. As he returned to his lathe, his phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. Don't forget dinner with Jack and Kate tonight. James smiled slightly. Jack Morrison, another veteran he'd hired last year, had been dating Detective Kate Chen for a few months now. The dinner had been planned for weeks, but as James brushed sawdust from his project, his mind wasn't on dinner plans. It was on the way Magnus's crew had positioned themselves, the practiced efficiency of their movements, the subtle signs that suggested their protection racket was just the surface of something much deeper. He'd seen operations like this before, in places far from Pine Ridge Valley's quiet streets. Criminal enterprises hiding behind legitimate fronts, using intimidation to establish control while running more profitable ventures in the shadows. The question was, how far did Iron Legion MC's true business reach? For now, though, he had Mrs. Peterson's cabinets to finish. As he worked, James fought the familiar itch that had started at the base of his skull, the one that had saved his life more times than he could count. The workshop radio crackled with a news report about increased weapons seizures in neighboring counties. James turned it up slightly, listening for details that might connect to his morning visitors. Some things you could leave behind when you left the service, but some things, like the instinct to hunt down threats before they grew too large, those stayed with you. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Sophie. Love you. Stay safe today. If she only knew. Mrs. Peterson's Victorian home stood proud against the autumn foliage, its wraparound porch showcasing James's recent restoration work. As he carried the first of the custom cabinets inside, his mind still processed the morning's encounter. Through the kitchen window, he noticed Mrs. Peterson watching anxiously from her garden, her usual cheerful demeanor subdued. James, dear, she called out as he approached with another cabinet. I saw those awful men at your workshop this morning. I was trimming my roses when they rode past. She opened the door wider, the smell of fresh coffee and apple pie wafting out. They've been around more lately, those bikers, making everyone nervous. James followed her inside, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she poured him coffee. You've seen them before? Oh yes, Mrs. Peterson replied, setting a slice of pie before him. Started showing up about 2 months ago. First just passing through, then lingering around the shopping district. Last week, Mr. Chen's furniture store paid for protection. His daughter, Kate, the detective, she was furious. James's ears perked up at the mention of Kate Chen. He'd have to remember to bring this up at dinner tonight. The cabinets look good here, he said, keeping his tone professional despite his growing interest in Mrs. Peterson's observations. James, she touched his arm gently, lowering her voice. Be careful. These men, they're not just thugs. I've seen things, late at night, strange deliveries at the old lumber mill on River Road. Cars I don't recognize, people speaking foreign languages. Nobody's used that mill in years, but there's activity there at all hours now. James nodded, absorbing the information while maintaining his carpenter's demeanor. I'll check the cabinet alignment once more, Mrs. Peterson. Upstairs? As he worked on the final adjustments, James's mind pieced together the pattern. Iron Legion MC was moving systematically through the town, establishing their presence while setting up something bigger. The lumber mill Mrs. Peterson mentioned could explain their confidence. They already had infrastructure in place. His phone buzzed. A text from Jack Morrison. Boss, got a weird request for custom work at 1879 River Road. Guy insisting on late-night delivery, paying cash. Something feels off. The address made James pause. That was the lumber mill Mrs. Peterson had mentioned. I'll handle it personally, he texted back. Just then his phone buzzed again, this time an unknown number. Your tools are looking sharp today. Be a shame if something happened to them. James deleted the message, his jaw tightening. The game was starting sooner than expected. Later that afternoon, while installing the Miller family's table, James noticed a black motorcycle cruising past slowly. The rider, wearing Iron Legion MC colors, made no attempt to hide his surveillance. James pretended to check his level while surreptitiously photographing the rider with his phone. The day continued like this. Routine installations interspersed with subtle signs of watching eyes. By 4 p.m., James had logged 3 different Iron Legion members tailing him on his routes. Their technique was professional, suggesting military or law enforcement background. This wasn't just a gang of thugs. At his last job of the day, installing custom shelving, James noticed something interesting. While measuring for final adjustments, he overheard his client on the phone arguing about a protection payment to Iron Legion MC. The amount mentioned, $5,000 monthly, was excessive for a simple protection racket. It suggested money laundering. As the sun began to set, James headed home, his mind working through the puzzle pieces. Iron Legion MC was too organized, too strategic in their expansion. Their protection racket wasn't just about intimidation. It was about establishing a network of businesses for something bigger. Pulling into his driveway, James noticed Sophie's car was already home. Through the kitchen window, he could see her preparing dinner, probably for their evening with Jack and Kate. The normality of the scene contrasted sharply with the day's developments. Inside, Sophie greeted him with a kiss, her green eyes searching his face. After 10 years of marriage, she could read his tension like a book. Tough day? Had some interesting customers, James replied, keeping his tone light. How was the school? Sophie's work as a high school counselor often gave her useful insights into the community's undercurrents. Strange day? Had 2 students talking about older siblings getting recruited by some motorcycle club? New gang in town apparently offering opportunities to local kids. She paused, her expression troubled. Kate stopped by during lunch. She's worried, says there's something big happening, but the department can't piece it together. James nodded, thinking about the lumber mill on River Road. Think she'll talk about it at dinner? Probably. She's been frustrated lately, says her hands are tied by jurisdiction issues and lack of evidence. Sophie studied him carefully. You've noticed something, haven't you? Before James could answer, his phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. Final warning. Smart woodworkers know when to look the other way. Sophie read the message over his shoulder, her face paling. James. It's nothing, he assured her, deleting the message. But they both knew better. The quiet life they'd built was about to change. As James showered and changed quickly, his military instincts were on high alert. As he dressed, he caught himself automatically checking sight lines through the windows, mentally marking potential vulnerabilities in their home security. Old habits weren't just dying hard. They were coming back with a vengeance. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 p.m. Jack Morrison's punctuality was one of the reasons James had hired him, that and their shared background in special operations. Kate Chen arrived moments later, still in her detective's blazer, looking tired but determined. As they settled around the dinner table, James could feel the weight of untold stories hanging over them. Jack Morrison seemed unusually tense, kept glancing at Kate, who in turn pushed her food around more than eating it. Finally, Kate broke the silence. James, we need to talk about what's happening in Pine Ridge Valley, and I think you might be able to help. James set down his fork, meeting her gaze. Does this have anything to do with Iron Legion MC? Kate's eyes sharpened. What do you know about them? Enough to know they're not just a motorcycle club, James replied, thinking of the day's events. And after today, I think they're about to make a big move. Jack leaned forward. Boss, those custom work requests we've been getting in certain neighborhoods, they're mapping the territory. Using legitimate businesses as cover for something bigger, James finished. Old lumber mill on River Road ring any bells? Kate pulled out her notebook. Tell me everything you've noticed. And James, be careful. These people, they're not what they seem. James thought of his ransacked workshop, the lumber mill, the pattern of protection payments. No, he agreed. There's something much worse. And as the evening unfolded, James realized that his quiet life as a carpenter was about to become anything but quiet. Iron Legion MC had unknowingly challenged the wrong man, and now the real game was about to begin. The dinner dishes had barely been cleared when Kate spread out a series of photographs across James's dining room table. Crime scene shots, surveillance stills, and mug shots created a mosaic of Iron Legion MC's growing influence in Pine Ridge Valley. We've been tracking their movements for months, Kate explained, pointing to a photo of Magnus. Magnus Eriksson, former military, dishonorable discharge. He took over Iron Legion MC 2 years ago and transformed it from a rowdy biker club into something more organized. But we can't prove what they're really doing. James studied the photos, his trained eye catching details others might miss. The lumber mill appeared in several shots, always at night, always with the same pattern of activity. These delivery schedules, he noted, they're too regular for random shipments. Exactly. Kate nodded. They're hiding something bigger in plain sight, but every time we get close to proof, it disappears. They've got someone inside the department, James. That's why I'm here. Unofficially. Jack shifted uncomfortably. Boss, that custom work request for the lumber mill, I did some checking. It's registered to a company called Legion Enterprises. On paper, they handle custom furniture exports. Perfect cover for moving other merchandise, James mused. Kate, how many weapons have been seized in the county recently? 23 in the past month, Sophie interjected. All untraceable, according to the news. My students talk about how easy it is to get hardware these days. James's mind raced through the implications. Iron Legion MC wasn't just running guns. They were manufacturing them. The protection racket, the lumber mill, the regular deliveries. It all pointed to a sophisticated operation. The next morning, James's workshop told its own story. The pristine tools were now scattered and broken, custom pieces smashed, and workbenches overturned. Last warning was carved into his prized workbench. Instead of anger, James felt a familiar calm settle over him. He photographed the damage methodically, noting the technique used in the destruction. The tool marks showed a leftward slant, someone right-handed working quickly but with purpose. His phone rang. Mrs. Peterson's worried voice came through. James, dear, I saw them do it late last night. I got it on video with that security system my son installed. I'm scared to show the police, but I'll be right there, Mrs. Peterson. Don't show that video to anyone else. 20 minutes later, James sat in Mrs. Peterson's living room, watching grainy footage of 3 Iron Legion members destroying his workshop. Their movements were professional, coordinated. One stood watch while 2 worked, all wearing gloves despite the warm night. There's more, Mrs. Peterson said quietly. Watch what happens after. The footage showed the bikers meeting a police cruiser 2 blocks away. The officer handed them something. Papers, maybe money. The exchange was quick, practiced. That's Officer Reed. James recognized him. Kate had mentioned they had someone inside the department. Mrs. Peterson's hands trembled as she poured more coffee. They're watching everyone, James. Last night I saw more deliveries at the lumber mill. Big trucks this time, not just motorcycles. Something's changing. James copied the video to his phone, his mind already formulating a plan. Mrs. Peterson, I need you to do something for me. Call the city about a major safety concern at your property. Say you're worried about structural integrity. Make it sound urgent. "You're going to investigate the lumber mill," she stated, not asked. "The less you know, the safer you'll be. But keep your camera running." Back in his van, James called Jack. "Need you to handle my regular jobs today. I'm taking the lumber mill job." James drove to a nearby hardware store, purchasing supplies that would look normal in a carpenter's van, but could serve other purposes. Sawdust could mask movement, wood glue could handle more than just wood, and power tools could cut through more than lumber. At noon, James parked outside the lumber mill, pretending to catalog damaged wood stock while observing the facility's security patterns. 2 guards rotating shifts, cameras on all corners, loading dock on the north side partially hidden from street view. His phone buzzed with a text from Kate. "Reed just called in about suspicious activity near the mill. Get out of there." But James had seen enough. The mill's ventilation system, the pattern of deliveries, the security setup. It all confirmed his suspicions. Iron Legion MC wasn't just distributing weapons, they were manufacturing them. Custom machinery hidden behind legitimate woodworking equipment. The perfect cover for an illegal weapons operation. As he packed his tools, a motorcycle rolled past slowly. The rider was Victor the Ghost Rodriguez, Magnus's second in command. Through his mirrors, James watched Ghost make a call, likely reporting his presence. The game was escalating. Iron Legion MC had meant to intimidate him with the workshop destruction, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd given him a reason to look closer, to push back. And now he had proof of their police connection. Driving home, James composed a careful text to Kate. "Got what we needed. Reed's compromised. Meet tonight. Usual place. Bring Jack." His van, still covered in splinters and sawdust from the vandalism, drew stares from passing cars. But James didn't mind. Let them think they'd scared him. Let them think the destruction had worked. They'd learn soon enough that they'd picked the wrong craftsman to intimidate. The question was, how much damage could he do to their operation before they realized their mistake? As he pulled into his driveway, James noticed fresh motorcycle tracks on the street. They were watching his house now, upping the pressure. Good. Let them focus on him. It would make them sloppy, make them miss what he was really doing. Inside, he began planning his next move. The lumber mill's layout would provide perfect cover for surveillance, but first, he needed to deal with Officer Reed. A corrupt cop could destroy everything before they had a chance to take down Iron Legion MC's operation. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from Magnus. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carpenter." James smiled slightly as he deleted the message. They had no idea what game they were really playing, or who they were really playing against. The meeting place was Jack's workshop, converted into a small woodworking studio where he handled overflow custom jobs. As James pulled up in his vandalized van, he noticed Kate's unmarked car parked 2 blocks away, standard procedure for avoiding attention. Inside, Jack had already set up a makeshift command center on his workbench, laying out blueprints of the industrial district. "Reed's been with the department 6 years, Kate began without preamble, spreading out personnel files. Started taking bribes about a year ago, right when Iron Legion MC moved into the area. But he's not the only one. We've got at least 3 other officers compromised." James studied the lumber mill blueprints while she talked. The machinery setup is excessive for standard woodworking. They've modified it recently. See these permit applications? All filed through legitimate channels, but the specifications are interesting. Jack leaned closer. Industrial-grade metal cutting equipment, way more than you'd need for furniture making. They're manufacturing something in there. Custom weapons, James confirmed, but they're smart about it. Everything looks legitimate on paper. The protection racket isn't just for money. It's building a network of businesses they can use for distribution and money laundering. Kate's phone buzzed. She checked it, her expression darkening. Another weapons seizure just came in. Same untraceable signature. They're flooding the streets with these things. James felt his jaw tighten. The crisis wasn't just about crime anymore. Lives were at stake. "We need to get inside that mill, not just surveillance. We need hard evidence." "They've got cameras everywhere," Jack pointed out. "Security's tight." "But they need carpentry work," James replied. A plan forming. Every manufacturing operation needs to maintain appearances. Sooner or later, they'll have issues they can't ignore without raising suspicion. Kate caught his meaning. You want to force their hand? Create a problem they have to call you to fix? Mrs. Peterson's already helped set it up. A structural integrity complaint about that section of town. The city will have to investigate. Iron Legion MC will need to show they're a legitimate business, which means letting building inspectors examine their facility. Jack grinned. And who better to check their woodworking setup than the local expert they've been trying to intimidate? As they discussed details, James's phone lit up with a text from Sophie. 2 of my students dropped out today. Both had older siblings recently recruited by Iron Legion. The news strengthened James's resolve. Kate, I need everything you've got on their security patterns. Jack, tomorrow we're going to have some very visible structural problems near that mill. Nothing too obvious, but enough to justify a full inspection. They'll be watching you, Kate warned. Count on it. That's why we need to give them something to watch. Jack, how's your acting? The next morning, James's van, still bearing Iron Legion MC's destruction, pulled up to the lumber mill's perimeter. Jack arrived separately in his own truck, and they made a show of checking support beams and taking measurements. It didn't take long for the surveillance to start. 2 motorcycles circled the area, their riders taking photos. James recognized one as Ghost, Magnus's enforcer. Good. Let them think they knew what was happening. Around noon, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed Legion Enterprises. Mr. Cooper, we've been informed about some structural concerns in our area. The city suggested we have our facility inspected. James kept his voice professionally neutral. Of course I can fit you in tomorrow morning. It's a mandatory inspection given the complaints. There was a pause on the other end. Tomorrow at 9. Someone will meet you at the loading dock. After hanging up, James texted Kate, We're in. Have your people ready. The rest of the day was spent preparing. James modified his tools, installing miniature cameras and sensors that could map the mill's layout, while appearing to check structural integrity. Jack worked on a custom set of measuring equipment that could detect metal shavings and gunpowder residue without alerting Iron Legion MC's security measures. That evening, as James cleaned his tools, Sophie came home from the school looking troubled. 3 more students withdrew today, she said quietly, all connected to families that recently started paying protection money. James, whatever they're planning with these weapons, they're recruiting our kids to help distribute them. He pulled her close, feeling her tremble slightly. We're going to stop them. But I need you to be ready. Once this starts, they might come after anyone connected to me. I'm not afraid, she replied, her voice stronger. Just be careful tomorrow. These people, they're not just criminals. The way these kids talk about the operation, whatever weapons they're pushing, it's something organized, something military grade. James nodded, pieces clicking into place. The industrial equipment, the regular deliveries, the excessive security. Iron Legion MC wasn't just assembling street weapons. They were running a sophisticated arms manufacturing operation, creating something unique and lethal. His phone buzzed one last time that night, a message from Magnus. Smart people learn from warnings. Tomorrow's your last chance to be smart. James deleted the message and finished preparing his equipment. Tomorrow would change everything. Either he'd get the evidence they needed to take down Iron Legion MC, or he'd become their next target. Either way, the real game was about to begin. 9 o'clock sharp, James pulled his vandalized van up to the lumber mill's loading dock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot where 3 motorcycles and 2 black SUVs were already parked. Through his rearview mirror, he watched Ghost and another Iron Legion member emerge from the guard shack, their postures tense. Mr. Cooper, Ghost called out, his voice carrying a forced politeness. We'll need to check your equipment before you enter. James gathered his tools, each one carefully modified to serve dual purposes. The laser level could map room layouts, the moisture meter could detect gunpowder residue. Even his tablet, seemingly displaying building schematics, was set to record everything. Inside the mill's front area, they maintained a perfect facade of legitimacy. Lumber stacks lined the walls, order forms displayed proper documentation, and a small office area housed standard business equipment. But James's trained eye caught the subtle details: the reinforced interior doors, the sophisticated ventilation system, the carefully positioned security cameras. Victor "Ghost" Rodriguez met them in the main area. "We'll escort you through the facility. Some areas are restricted. Proprietary manufacturing information, you understand?" "Of course," James replied, setting down his tools. "I'll need to check all main support structures and load-bearing elements. City regulations, given the structural integrity reports." As they moved through the mill, James mentally mapped the layout. The front area used about 40% of the space, but heavy security doors blocked access to the rest. The visible woodworking equipment was new, recently installed, but it connected to other systems that led to the restricted area. "What's behind those doors?" James asked casually, testing a support beam. "Need to check all structural points for potential stress." Ghost exchanged looks with another guard. "Storage areas. Nothing that would affect structural integrity." James nodded, but his instruments were already gathering data. The power usage for those storage areas was massive. The ventilation system hummed continuously, and beneath the sawdust smell, he detected the distinct odor of metal working and gunpowder his military experience had taught him to recognize. Working methodically, James made his way through the accessible areas, his modified equipment scanning and recording. He noted the patterns of guard rotations, the location of security cameras, and most importantly, the structural vulnerabilities that could prove useful later. "Load-bearing capacity seems compromised in this section," he announced, approaching a wall that backed up to the restricted area. "Might need to check the main support beam. Should be accessed through there." He pointed to the heavy security door. Ghost's hand moved subtly toward his jacket. "That won't be necessary. We'll have our maintenance team check it." "City requires a licensed contractor to sign off," James pressed, watching their reactions. "Otherwise, they'll send their own inspectors." The tension in the room spiked. Ghost's hand also strayed toward his weapon, but another guard raised a subtle hand to stop him. "Give us a minute to secure the area." While they stepped away to make calls, James continued his inspection, his equipment silently gathering evidence. The sensors in his measuring tools had already detected traces of gunpowder and metal shavings, and his tablet was compiling a detailed map of the facility's layout. A door opened behind him, and Magnus himself strode in, his presence immediately dominating the space. "Mr. Cooper, I hear you're being very thorough today." "Just doing my job," James replied evenly, packing up his tools. "City takes structural integrity seriously." Magnus moved closer, his voice dropping. "You know what I think? I think you're too smart to be just a carpenter. Military, right? The way you move, the way you observe. What branch?" "Did my time in the Army," James answered, maintaining his cover. "Nothing special. Just wanted a quiet life after." Magnus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Noble. But see, here's the thing about quiet lives. They only stay quiet if you keep them that way. You've got family, right? A wife, nice house. Be a shame if something disturbed that peace." The threat hung in the air between them. James shouldered his toolbox, meeting Magnus's gaze. "Just here to check the building's integrity. Found some issues that'll need addressing. I'll send the report to the city." "Do that," Magnus replied, "but remember, reports can be amended, problems can be forgotten. Your workshop's already seen what happens to people who don't understand how things work around here." As James walked back to his van, he could feel their eyes on him. He'd gotten what he needed: proof of their operation, layout of their facility, and most importantly, confirmation of what they were manufacturing. But he'd also painted a target on his back. Starting his van, James sent a coded text to Kate. "Package secured. Bigger than we thought." Then to Jack. "Start Phase 2. Iron Legion MC had just revealed more than they intended. Now it was time to use that information to tear their operation apart from the inside. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Sophie, but before he could answer, he spotted 3 motorcycles pulling out behind his van. The surveillance was starting, the game was shifting, and the stakes were about to get much higher. The surveillance team following James's van didn't bother being subtle anymore. 3 Iron Legion riders maintained constant visual contact, their black motorcycles appearing in his mirrors at every turn. James deliberately took a winding route back to his shop, testing their patterns, noting their coordination. Professional, military trained. Sophie answered on the first ring when he called back. "James, someone broke into the house." His grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm fine. I was at school, but they went through everything, left a message on our bedroom wall. Carpenters should stick to wood." Her voice steadied. "They knew when I'd be teaching. They've been watching us." "Go to Jack's workshop," James instructed, checking his mirrors again. "Kate's got people watching it. I'll meet you there. But first..." He had to deal with his tail. James pulled into a busy shopping center, deliberately parking his van between 2 delivery trucks. As the Iron Legion riders positioned themselves at different exits, he activated the first countermeasure he'd prepared. His modified tablet connected to the shopping center's fire alarm system, a trick he'd learned in Delta Force. Within seconds, sirens blared across the complex. In the confusion of evacuating shoppers and arriving emergency vehicles, James slipped his van out through the loading dock, leaving his pursuers scrambling. At Jack's workshop, Kate was already reviewing the data from his mill inspection. "This is bigger than we thought," she said, pointing to the readings. "They're not just manufacturing standard weapons, they're creating something military-grade, custom modifications, advanced materials." "That explains the specialized equipment," Sophie added, her voice steady despite the home invasion. "The recruitment patterns among my students. They're building a distribution network right through our schools." James spread out the mill schematics his equipment had mapped. "They've got a sophisticated operation, professional security, military-grade machinery, precision manufacturing systems. Magnus has built something more dangerous than a typical weapons ring." "And now they're escalating," Jack noted, gesturing to photos of James's destroyed workshop and Sophie's description of the house break-in. "They're sending a message." "No," James corrected. "They're revealing their weaknesses. Professional operators don't get personal. Magnus is showing us he's worried." Kate's phone buzzed, her face darkening as she read the message. 3 more weapons seizures just reported, different locations, all within the last hour. "They're clearing house," James realized, using our inspection as a trigger to move their operation. "Jack, remember that structural problem we discussed? Make the call." Jack grinned, dialing the city works department. Within minutes, he had filed an emergency report about major structural issues near the lumber mill. "City crews will start emergency stabilization tomorrow morning, right outside their main delivery route." "They'll have to reroute their shipments," Kate realized, "through areas they don't control." "And with the structural integrity report I filed," James added, "they'll have building inspectors watching their every move. Magnus will have to either shut down production or risk exposure." He turned to Kate. "How's our other project coming?" Kate pulled out her phone, showing a series of text messages. "Officer Reed took the bait. He's agreed to meet his contact tomorrow night. We'll have everything on video." As they finalized their plans, James's phone lit up with an incoming call from an unknown number. He put it on speaker. "Impressive moves today, Carpenter." Magnus's voice filled the room. "The fire alarm was a nice touch. Military training showing through. But now you've got a choice to make. There's a package in your van. Consider it a warning and a deadline. You've got 1 hour to reconsider your position." Inside the van's cargo area, they found a small box. Inside was a mobile phone showing a live stream, a video feed of Mrs. Peterson's house, where 3 Iron Legion members were clearly visible waiting. "They're targeting your witnesses," Kate said quietly. James checked his watch. 1 hour, just enough time for what Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. "To spring the trap they think they're setting." James pulled out a secure phone he'd kept from his Delta Force days. "Time to call in some favors." The secure phone connected after 2 rings. "Marcus, it's Cooper. Remember that favor you owe me from Kandahar? Time to collect." He outlined the situation quickly, his voice clipped and professional. "Need your team at these coordinates in 40 minutes. Kate was already mobilizing her own resources, careful to keep official channels quiet given the compromised officers. Jack pulled up Mrs. Peterson's house on his tablet, accessing the security cameras he'd helped install. 3 tangos on site, Jack reported, using their old military shorthand. 2 on the porch, 1 in the rear. Standard intimidation positioning. 4 more watching the perimeter, James added, noting the motorcycles partially hidden on adjacent streets. They're expecting us to come in hot. Sophie, who had been quietly studying the footage, pointed to something they'd missed. Mrs. Peterson's not home. Look, her car's gone, but they don't seem to know that. James allowed himself a small smile. The senior center schedule he'd memorized clicked into place. Thursday afternoon, she volunteers at the community center until 6. They didn't do their homework. Sloppy, Kate realized. No, James corrected. Desperate. Magnus is rushing, making mistakes. The city inspection rattled him more than we thought. He checked his watch. 35 minutes until their deadline. Time to move. The plan came together quickly. Kate's unmarked units would quietly evacuate the neighbors using a gas leak story as cover. Jack would approach from the east, setting up surveillance on the perimeter. James had other plans. They'll be watching for my van, he said, pulling out a set of building inspector coveralls. So let's give them something else to watch. 20 minutes later, a city building inspector's truck rolled slowly down Mrs. Peterson's street. James, dressed in coveralls with a clipboard in hand, looked every bit the bureaucrat investigating reported structural issues. 2 houses down, he started checking foundations, making a show of logging readings. The Iron Legion members on Mrs. Peterson's porch shifted uneasily. This wasn't part of their script. One reached for his phone, presumably calling Magnus for instructions. That's when the real operation began. Marcus's team, comprised of former Spec Ops veterans who now worked high-end security contracts, had moved into position with ghost-like efficiency. They weren't wearing tactical gear or carrying obvious weapons. They looked like ordinary suburbanites walking dogs or doing yard work, but they were steadily tightening a noose around the Iron Legion team. James's radio crackled. Package secure, Marcus reported. Mrs. Peterson was safely being diverted from her route home, picked up by an unmarked car at the community center. 15 minutes to deadline. The Iron Legion member in the rear of Mrs. Peterson's house was the first to sense something was wrong. He'd spotted Jack's careful surveillance and was moving to investigate. James gave the signal. In the next 60 seconds, several things happened simultaneously. The power on the street cut out, a maintenance issue Kate had arranged. As the Iron Legion members reflexively checked their phones, they found no signal, courtesy of Marcus's team's electronic warfare suite. Then the building inspector truck's side panel slid open, revealing Kate and 2 trusted officers with warrant badges clearly displayed. Police! Everyone on the ground! The Iron Legion members reacted with professional speed, but they were already surrounded. Marcus's team emerged from their covers, their own credentials visible. Private security contractors working with law enforcement. Everything legal and by the book. This is a mistake, one of the bikers started to say, reaching slowly for his jacket. The mistake, James called out, approaching with his own credentials now visible, was threatening an innocent witness. That's witness intimidation, a federal offense when connected to weapons trafficking. The color drained from the bikers' faces as they recognized James beneath the building inspector uniform. Behind them, Jack was already downloading footage from Mrs. Peterson's security cameras, documenting their presence and intent. Your deadline, James continued, just expired. And you just gave us probable cause to dig deeper into Iron Legion MC's activities. Kate's radio crackled. The perimeter team had been captured without incident. 7 Iron Legion members in custody, all caught in the act of witness intimidation. But James knew this was just the beginning. His phone buzzed. Magnus. You have no idea what you've started, Magnus growled. No, James replied calmly. You have no idea what you started when you destroyed my workshop. But you're about to find out. He ended the call and turned to Kate. Magnus will retaliate hard and fast. "We're ready," she assured him. "Reed's meeting his contact tonight. Once we have proof of police corruption, we'll have our opening." But first, James looked at the captured Iron Legion members being loaded into unmarked cars. "Let's see what our friends here can tell us about that lumber mill operation." The game was changing. Magnus had tried to show force to intimidate. Instead, he'd given them the legal leverage they needed to start dismantling his organization. As James watched the last of the bikers being driven away, he couldn't help but appreciate the irony. All of this, the investigation, the coming takedown of a major weapons operation, had started because they'd chosen to destroy the wrong Carpenter's workshop. Back at the Tactical Operations Center they'd set up in Jack's workshop, James watched the interrogation feeds. The 7 Iron Legion members sat in separate rooms at the station, each trying to maintain their tough persona, but James had seen enough interrogations to recognize the cracks forming. "Ghost is the weak link," he noted, pointing to one of the screens. "Watch his hands, he's got the shakes, either withdrawal or fear." Kate nodded. "Magnus runs a tight operation. Anyone who gets caught faces consequences far worse than jail time." The police scanner crackled with sudden activity, reports of multiple fires breaking out across Pine Ridge Valley, all targeting businesses that had refused Iron Legion MC's protection racket. Magnus's retaliation had begun. "He's sending a message," Jack said, marking the fire locations on their map. "No," James studied the pattern carefully. "He's creating a diversion. Look, the fires form a perimeter around their main operation areas. He's using the chaos to move something." Sophie, who had been monitoring police frequencies, suddenly straightened. 3 more weapons caches just discovered, different locations, all within the last hour. "They're clearing out evidence," James realized, using the fires as cover to clear their satellite locations. He turned to Kate. "When is Reed's meeting?" 2 hours. Downtown parking garage. He thinks he's meeting an Iron Legion contact to arrange safe passage for a shipment." James checked his equipment one last time. The fires had changed the dynamic, but they'd also created an opportunity. With emergency services stretched thin, Iron Legion MC would feel confident, more likely to take risks. "Jack, get to the lumber mill. Watch their movements. If they start moving major equipment, we need to know." James turned to Sophie. "I need you at the school. If they're clearing out operations, we might see movement in their student network. Document everything." "What about Mrs. Peterson?" Sophie asked. "Safe house," Kate assured them. "Marcus's team is handling her security. Magnus won't find her." James's phone lit up with another call from Magnus. He put it on speaker. "Impressed with the fires?" Magnus's voice was calm, controlled. "Just a taste of what's coming. You're good, Cooper. Special forces, right? Delta, maybe. But you've got too many people to protect, too many weak points. Stand down now or the next message won't be so subtle." "You're burning your own territory," James replied. "Desperate move." Magnus laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Think bigger, Carpenter. Those fires, they're just the opening act. You've got one more chance. There's a briefcase in the dumpster behind your shop. $5 million in cash. Take it, leave town, forget what you've seen, or tomorrow's headlines will be about tragedy striking Pine Ridge Valley's first responders." The threat hung in the air after Magnus disconnected. Kate was already calling in the bomb squad to check the briefcase. James's mind raced through the implications. "He's threatening emergency services," Sophie said quietly, "during a crisis he created." "No," James corrected, a cold certainty settling over him. "He's telling us his next move. The fires are targeting businesses that refused his protection. Tomorrow's targets? The people who protect those businesses." "Police, fire, medical," Kate finished. Jack's voice crackled over the radio. "Boss, major movement at the lumber mill. They're loading something into unmarked vans, big equipment, military crates." James checked his watch. Everything was accelerating. Magnus was clearing out his operation, but he needed time he planned to buy by creating citywide chaos. "Kate, move up Reed's meeting. Magnus is going to need his cops, corrupt or cleared out, before whatever he's planning tomorrow." He won't show if we change the time, Kate argued. He will if he thinks Magnus ordered it. Send the message through the usual channel. Tell him the timetables moved up due to unexpected heat. He'll understand. As Kate made the arrangements, James pulled up the city's emergency response protocols on his tablet. Magnus's threat wasn't just about violence. It was about infrastructure. Targeting first responders would create gaps in the system, blind spots his people could exploit. Sophie, get to the school. Quiet word to security, but keep it contained. We can't risk tipping our hand. James turned to Jack's video feed. How many vans? 4 so far, boss. Military precision in the loading. These aren't regular bikers. These guys move like contractors. The pieces were falling into place. Magnus wasn't just running guns. He was operating a private military company under the cover of a motorcycle gang. The fires, the threats, the coordinated response to their operation at Mrs. Peterson's house. Everything spoke of professional training. James's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Package secured. Briefcase contained $5 million plus a bonus. Detailed emergency response protocols for Pine Ridge Valley. Someone's been doing their homework. That's how they know where to hit, Kate realized. They've got our playbook. James nodded grimly. Magnus isn't trying to scare us off anymore. He's declaring war. The scanner crackled with more fire reports. In the distance, sirens wailed across Pine Ridge Valley. The night was just beginning, and somewhere in the chaos, Officer Reed was preparing to meet a contact who didn't exist. The next few hours would determine whether they could stop Magnus's operation or watch their town burn. The parking garage loomed dark and quiet, a concrete fortress in downtown Pine Ridge Valley. James watched from his modified van as Officer Reed's patrol car circled the structure for the 3rd time. The corrupt cop was being careful, following his training even while betraying his badge. Target approaching level 3, Jack reported from his observation post. He's alone but nervous, keeps checking his mirrors. Kate's voice crackled over the secure channel. All units hold position. Let him get comfortable. James adjusted his surveillance equipment, the van's interior now resembling a tactical command center rather than a carpenter's workspace. The screens showed multiple angles of the garage, tracking Reed's movement through the levels. Something's wrong, James said suddenly, noticing a pattern in Reed's driving. He's not just being cautious, he's waiting for something. Before Kate could respond, new headlights appeared at the garage entrance. 3 motorcycles and a black SUV running dark. Iron Legion MC hadn't taken the bait. They'd set their own trap. Kate, Reed's compromised. Magnus knows about the operation. James was already moving, switching to backup frequencies their police leak wouldn't know about. Dave, get those surveillance feeds to Marcus. Everyone else switch to contingency plan, Charlie. The garage erupted into activity. Reed's patrol car screeched to a stop on level 3 while the motorcycles split up to cover different access points. The SUV moved purposefully toward the upper levels. They're not here to meet Reed, James realized, watching the precision of their movements. They're using our operation as cover for something else. Kate's voice was tense. James, another weapons cache just discovered. This batch is different. Military-grade hardware. Whatever they're planning, it's starting now. Through his surveillance feed, James watched Reed abandon his car and run toward the stairs. The officer wasn't heading for an exit. He was moving up toward the roof access. The SUV had also parked on the top level. Jack, get me thermal imaging of that SUV. The infrared feed showed multiple heat signatures in the vehicle's cargo area. Not people, but containers. Hot ones. They're using our surveillance of Reed as cover to move their specialized equipment, James announced. The fires, the weapons caches, this meeting, it's all distraction. They're relocating their advanced manufacturing operation right under our noses. Kate cursed. We've got units surrounding the garage. Should we move in? Negative. James was already formulating a new plan. Magnus wants us to shut down this garage, create another crisis point. Let them think their diversion is working. He switched channels. Marcus, you copy? Standing by with 3 teams. Track that SUV when it leaves. They'll lead us to their new manufacturing location. But first, James focused on Reed's heat signature, now meeting with others on the roof. Let's make sure our corrupt officer doesn't leave with them. The next few minutes were a symphony of coordinated movement. While Iron Legion MC loaded their cargo into the SUV, James's team quietly disabled their motorcycles using specialized equipment from his van. On the roof, Reed was visibly arguing with the bikers, his gestures becoming more agitated. "He's realized they're hanging him out to dry," Kate observed. "Magnus is cutting loose anyone who could compromise him," James agreed. "Watch Reed's right hand, he's going for his weapon." The confrontation on the roof suddenly turned violent. Reed drew his service pistol, but the Iron Legion members were faster. A brief struggle ended with Reed unconscious, his body quickly loaded into the SUV along with the containers. "All units hold," James ordered, watching the SUV begin its descent. "Let them think they've won." As the vehicle reached street level, the motorcycles wouldn't start. The bikers, professional as they were, showed their first signs of panic. "Now," James commanded. The garage exits suddenly blazed with light. Not police lights, but industrial floodlights from surrounding construction sites. The SUV was caught in the open, its driver temporarily blinded. Marcus's teams emerged from their hiding spots, wearing standard security uniforms rather than tactical gear. To any observers, it would look like a routine security response to suspicious activity. The SUV driver made a split-second decision, gunning the engine toward the darkened street beyond the lights. They left their motorcycle escorts behind, exactly as James had planned. "Kate, pick up our stranded bikers. Marcus, maintain discreet surveillance on the SUV. Jack, get me a snapshot of those containers they loaded. Time to see what Magnus is really moving." Within minutes, the abandoned Iron Legion members were in custody, their motorcycles impounded. Reed was gone, but they had witnesses who could testify to his corruption. More importantly, they had proof of Magnus's organization kidnapping a police officer, corrupt or not. James's phone lit up with multiple messages. Sophie reporting unusual student movements, Jack sending images of the containers, Kate updating him on the biker's interrogation, and finally, a message from Magnus himself. "Impressive setup, but while you were watching the garage, we were busy elsewhere. Check the news." James switched to a local news station on his tablet. Breaking news banner. Multiple explosions reported at City Armory. Weapons feared stolen. Magnus's real plan was becoming clear. The garage operation wasn't just a diversion. It was one piece of a larger strategy to create city-wide chaos, and they'd just lost their best lead on stopping it. The Armory's emergency lights cast an eerie glow across the evacuation zone. James pulled up in his van, now wearing his old building contractor uniform, the perfect cover for accessing a facility during a crisis. His tablet displayed a real-time feed of the facility's systems, patterns he'd recognized from years of dealing with municipal infrastructure. 3 explosive devices, Kate reported through his earpiece. Small charges, precisely placed. They weren't trying to destroy the facility. "No," James agreed, studying the damage points. "They're creating a distraction while compromising the security systems. Look at the placement. They're targeting specific storage zones." Jack's voice crackled over the comm. "Boss, those containers from the garage." Finally got a clear image. "They're not just manufacturing equipment. They're military-grade weapon modification kits." The pieces clicked into place. James's military training combined with his construction expertise revealing Magnus's true plan. They're not just moving their operation. They're upgrading it. The fires, the garage operation, it's all cover for their real endgame. Sophie's urgent voice cut in. "James, seeing a pattern. New weapons appearing in specific neighborhoods. They're testing distribution zones." James pulled up the city's security system schematics on his tablet. The Armory wasn't just a storage facility. It was a hub for law enforcement across the entire region. Magnus wasn't trying to shut it down. He was turning it into a base of operations. "Where's that SUV?" he asked. "Marcus lost them in the industrial district," Kate replied. "They're using the evacuation chaos for cover." James studied the city map, his mind racing through possibilities. They'll need access to their new manufacturing setup. There are only 3 locations with the right infrastructure where they could set up an operation this size. The abandoned steel mill, Jack realized. It's not on most city maps, but a contractor would know it. And Magnus has our emergency protocols, Kate added. He knows exactly when and where response teams will be focused. James's phone buzzed with a text from Magnus. Enjoying the show? This is what happens when you force someone to escalate. But don't worry, the real performance is just beginning. Another explosion rocked the armory, this one larger than the others. But James noticed something everyone else missed. The blast pattern was directed inward toward the weapons storage, not outward for maximum damage. He's creating breach points in the system, James explained, his construction knowledge proving crucial. When emergency teams try to secure the armory, they'll push right into his trap. Sophie's voice was urgent. James, just got word. Police are mobilizing for multiple threats. They're expecting coordinated attacks. No, James corrected, a cold certainty settling over him. Magnus is smarter than that. He doesn't want destruction. He wants control. The armory isn't for stealing weapons. It's for controlling their distribution. He's going to turn the entire region's weapons supply chain into his personal network. Kate caught on quickly. Create a weapons crisis. Force the city to depend on his supply, and use the chaos to establish total control. The protection racket, the corrupt cops, the strategic property takeovers. It was all groundwork for this, James added. Jack's voice crackled with static. Boss, movement at access point 3, multiple vehicles, military equipment. That's their play, James said, already moving. They're using the evacuation to clear the area while they set up their distribution system. Once it's in place, the city will be hostage to their supply. Kate finished. James, get every available unit to the access points. Jack, I need the city's real security plans, not the public maps, but the maintenance schematics. Already on it, but what's Magnus's mistake? James allowed himself a grim smile as he started the van. He thinks he knows the security system because he has official city plans. But a contractor knows what's not on those plans. The old access tunnels, the forgotten entry points, the quirks of a system that's evolved over decades. His phone lit up with another text from Magnus. Almost time for the main event. Still think destroying your workshop was a mistake? James typed back a simple response. No, it was your mistake. You should have hired a better contractor. As emergency vehicles screamed past his van, James pulled up everything he knew about the city's infrastructure. Magnus had turned the armory into a weapon, but he'd forgotten something crucial. Who better to fight a building-based threat than a contractor who used to be in special forces? The real war for Pine Ridge Valley was about to begin, and it would be fought in the forgotten spaces beneath the city's surface. The access tunnel stretched before James like a concrete artery beneath the city, decades of watermarks staining its walls. He moved silently, years of special forces training combining with his intimate knowledge of the structure's layout. Behind him, Jack carried specialized equipment from their contractor's van, modified for this specific mission. 3 Iron Legion teams confirmed at the main access points. Kate's voice whispered through their earpieces. They're setting up some kind of distribution system. Magnus's people are professionals, James responded quietly, pausing at a junction. But they're following city blueprints. Those don't show the maintenance bypasses installed in the 90s. Jack checked their position on a worn maintenance schematic, not the official city plans, but a contractor's working document passed down through years of repairs and modifications. Next junction should connect to the original tunnel system, pre-World War II construction. The sound of voices and equipment echoed through the tunnels, distorted by the concrete walls. James held up his hand, signaling Jack to stop. Ahead, light spilled from one of the main distribution chambers. Through his tactical scope, James observed Magnus's operation. They'd set up a sophisticated weapons modification system, ready to process military hardware into untraceable merchandise. The equipment was military-grade, designed for efficient production. Marcus, you seeing this? James whispered into his comm. Affirmative. 4 tangos visible, all armed. They've got some kind of advanced manufacturing setup. They're not just modifying weapons, James realized, studying the equipment. They're using a binary production system. The parts only become functional when assembled. Probably why they needed the armory compromised. They're using our own security protocols to hide their supply chain. A new voice echoed through the tunnel. Officer Reed, now conscious and arguing with his captors. Magnus is insane. This will affect the entire region's law enforcement. That's the point, came Magnus's voice as he stepped into view. Control the supply, control the city. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, every department in 3 counties will be dependent on what only we can provide. James keyed his radio. Kate, tell Sophie to analyze the recent weapon seizures. Look for signs of partial assemblies. Magnus has been testing this method for weeks. While they waited for confirmation, James studied the chamber's layout. The Iron Legion members were professional, covering all obvious angles, but they were watching the main tunnels, not the maintenance bypasses. Boss, Jack whispered, we could use the old ventilation system. These tunnels were built with multiple air circulation routes, redundancy from the Cold War era. James nodded, already seeing the plan. If we trigger the emergency ventilation protocol, their whole assembly setup would be compromised. But we'd need to access the original control station, Jack finished, which isn't on their maps. Sarah, what's Sophie got? Her response came quickly. Confirmed. All recently seized weapons show signs of partial assembly. They're running a split production line. Magnus's voice echoed again, now giving final instructions to his team. Once the systems are primed, we trigger distribution. By morning, every law enforcement agency in Pine Ridge Valley will be processing our modified equipment. A month from now, we'll own this region's entire weapons infrastructure. James had heard enough. Jack, get to the old control station. When I give the signal, trigger the ventilation protocol. Marcus, have your teams ready to move on all access points simultaneously. What are you going to do? Jack asked. James checked his equipment one last time. Create a distraction. Magnus wants to play with building systems. Let's show him how a real contractor does it. 1 month after Iron Legion MC's downfall, James Cooper stood in his expanded workshop, watching the morning news. The headlines told a story few would have believed just weeks ago. Iron Legion MC leadership faces federal charges. Multi-state weapons operation dismantled. Small-town Carpenter helps uncover criminal empire. Magnus's trial was set to begin next week. The evidence was overwhelming. Carol Peterson's documentation, the seized equipment from the armory, testimony from turned members, and detailed financial records discovered in their various properties. The investigation had expanded beyond Pine Ridge Valley, revealing connections to international arms dealers and corrupt officials across multiple states. Still can't believe it started with a destroyed workshop, Jack said, entering with coffee. The business had grown, now employing several veterans who'd helped in the operation. Though I noticed you still haven't repaired all the damage. James ran his hand along a scarred workbench. Some damage tells a story worth keeping. Kate arrived next, carrying case files. Final briefing in an hour. DEA is expanding the investigation based on Magnus's connections. They're finding similar operations in other cities. Criminal organizations hiding behind legitimate businesses, using infrastructure to distribute illegal weapons. Any more threats? Jack asked, remembering the warning message James had received. Nothing concrete, Kate replied, but we're monitoring. Magnus's backers lost millions when we shut down their operation. People like that don't forget easily. Sophie entered through the back, having just finished her school day. The weapons crisis had ended with Iron Legion MC's fall, but the school had implemented new security protocols based on their experience. 3 more students returned to school today, she announced. The community support programs are making a real difference. James nodded, thinking of how Pine Ridge Valley had changed. The town had come together, turning the lessons of Magnus's operation into positive action. Business owners who'd suffered under the protection racket now participated in community watch programs. The corrupt officers had been replaced with vetted professionals. Even the armory had new security measures, designed with input from James's unique expertise. Mrs. Peterson had become something of a local celebrity, after her testimony helped secure indictments against Magnus's entire leadership. Her detailed documentation of Iron Legion MC's activities had inspired a citizen awareness program, teaching people to recognize and report suspicious patterns in their neighborhoods. "Got something to show you," Jack said, pulling up security footage on his tablet. The camera showed 3 motorcycles passing the workshop late last night, night riders wearing unfamiliar colors. "New crew trying to move into the power vacuum?" "Let them try," Kate responded. "We're better prepared now. The whole town is." James's phone buzzed, a message from Marcus, updating him on the broader investigation. Magnus's operation had been part of something larger, but its collapse had created a domino effect, exposing similar schemes across the country. What started with a destroyed workshop in Pine Ridge Valley had evolved into a nationwide operation against infrastructure-based weapons trafficking networks. "You know what Magnus said during his interrogation?" Kate asked, showing them the transcript. "He said their biggest mistake wasn't getting caught. It was thinking they could intimidate a simple carpenter into looking the other way." "They never understood what they were really facing," Sophie added. "Not just you, but this whole community. People who care about their homes, their neighbors, their town." James looked around his workshop, at the team he'd assembled, at the scarred workbench that had started it all. Iron Legion MC had tried to take over Pine Ridge Valley through fear and corruption, but they'd failed to recognize the strength in ordinary people doing honest work. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from Marcus. "New intel suggests remnants of Magnus's organization regrouping 2 states over. Might need a Carpenter's perspective on their operation. Interested?" James smiled, showing the message to his team. They all knew that somewhere out there other criminal enterprises were using similar tactics, thinking themselves untouchable. But now they had a template for fighting back, a lesson learned in Pine Ridge Valley about the danger of underestimating seemingly ordinary citizens. "Well," Jack grinned, "the tools could use a road trip." Looking at his scarred workbench, James thought about how a simple act of intimidation had led to all this. Iron Legion MC had wanted to send a message about power and control. Instead, they'd learned a different lesson, one about courage, community, and the mistake of judging people by appearances. "You know," James said, "I think it's time we added some new lettering to the workshop, something about specialized security consulting." The team laughed, but they understood the deeper truth. Sometimes the most effective warriors aren't the ones who look the part, but the ones who understand that real strength comes from protecting your community, one project at a time. And somewhere in a federal prison, Magnus was... Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.